At exactly 11:47 a.m., a single missile launched from Yemen. It was intercepted, no one was hurt, and the wreckage fell harmlessly into the desert. But the real target wasn't military. It was the United States dollar. Within minutes of that launch, the world's two most critical maritime choke points were paralyzed simultaneously. What is unfolding right now is not just a regional war, it is a calculated, catastrophic attack on the 50-year-old petrodollar system. A militia with no formal navy has just hijacked global trade, allowing Chinese and Russian ships to pass freely while forcing Western economies to bleed. Today we break down this dual choke point nightmare, and why the man who fired that missile might just achieve what rival superpowers have plotted for decades: the collapse of American financial dominance. The missile launched from Yemen at 11:47 in the morning. It crossed more than 2,000 kilometers of airspace before Israeli air defense batteries in the south detected it, tracked it, and intercepted it over Bersera. Nobody was hurt. The wreckage fell somewhere in the Negev desert, and within minutes, the most consequential financial event of the entire war happened. Not in Jerusalem, not in Washington, not in Throne. It happened in a Reuters terminal on a trading floor in London, where a single analyst stared at his screen and typed 4 words into his firm's internal chat: "The How is back." What followed in the next 90 minutes was not a military engagement. It was a financial cascade. War risk insurance premiums for Red Sea transit spiked before the dust from the intercept had settled. Shipping companies that had cautiously resumed partial Red Sea operations in the weeks following the November 2025 Gaza ceasefire activated their contingency protocols without waiting for official guidance. The Baltic and International Maritime Council issued a security warning. UKMTO sent a maritime advisory. Container spot rates on the Asia-Europe corridor twitched upward in real time, and somewhere in a Shanghai futures market, a trader who had been watching the Strait of Hormuz story all week looked at the Houthi announcement and made a bet on oil that will look very smart if what analysts are now saying comes true. He bet that when you close both choke points simultaneously, the dollar's role as the currency of global energy trade does not just get tested, it gets exposed. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why the Houthi entry into the current war on March 28th, 2026 is categorically different from every previous phase of their maritime campaign. Why the specific combination of a closed Strait of Hormuz and a reactivated Red Sea threat is not just an energy crisis, but a direct attack on the structural architecture of the petrodollar system. What the Houthi selective exemption strategy, free passage for Chinese and Russian, linked shipping, war risk for American and Israeli linked shipping, is doing to the competitive economics of global trade in ways that accelerate de-dollarization, regardless of whether a single missile hits another ship. Why the dollar's role as the currency of global energy settlement is uniquely vulnerable to exactly the dual choke point scenario that is now playing out. What the shipping industry, the insurance markets, and the central banks managing dollar reserves are doing right now in response to a threat. They had been wargaming for 2 years, and why the man who fired the missile from Yemen may understand the dollar's structural vulnerabilities better than most economists in Washington. This is a story that starts with a geography lesson, runs through a 50-year financial architecture, and ends with a question that no Treasury Department in any country has a clean answer to right now. Pull on the first thread. Draw a map in your mind. Start in the Persian Gulf, where the Strait of Hormuz connects the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and the UAE to the Indian Ocean. Through that strait, under normal conditions, flows approximately 20% of the world's oil supply. It is closed right now. Iran closed it on February 28, 2026, following American and Israeli strikes on Iranian territory. Move west across the Indian Ocean and north up the African coast. You reach the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow water passage between Yemen and the Horn of Africa that connects the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea. Through that strait and up through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal passes approximately 12 to 15% of global seaborne trade. Container ships, tankers, bulk carriers moving the manufactured goods, raw materials, and food that connect Asia to Europe and to the Mediterranean world. The Houthis control the Yemen coastline on the western side of the Bab el-Mandeb. They have missiles, drones, anti-8-ship cruise missiles, and unmanned surface vessels capable of striking ships transiting the Strait. When they are active, the Red Sea is not a safe shipping corridor. When they are active and the Hormuz is simultaneously closed, the two most critical maritime arteries connecting the energy-producing world to the energy-consuming world are simultaneously threatened. That is the situation that exists as of March 28, 2026. And that situation has never existed before in the history of the modern global economy. The Houthis had effectively paused large-scale maritime attacks in mid-November 2025, following a regional de-escalation linked to a Gaza ceasefire. From approximately November 11, 2025 until late February 2026, there were no sustained confirmed missile or drone attacks against merchant vessels attributable to the group. That 3.5-month pause was not a military defeat. It was not the product of American or British airstrikes destroying Houthi capability. It was a strategic pause, a deliberate choice to stand down while the regional diplomatic situation was managed, while the Gaza ceasefire held, and while the Houthis preserved their missile and drone inventories for the moment when resuming operations would achieve maximum strategic effect. The Houthis retain long-range drone and missile capabilities that have reshaped the Red Sea's balance of power. Iran has recently stepped up its transfer of weapons and expertise, expecting the Houthis to intervene on its behalf if needed. The word "if" is now obsolete. They intervened, and what they brought back to the Red Sea on March 28th was not the same campaign that had been paused in November. It was a campaign that had been rested, resupplied, and repositioned for exactly the strategic moment where its reactivation would cause the maximum possible disruption to the global economic architecture that Washington is trying to protect. Now, let us understand what the Houthis actually did to the Red Sea between November 2023 and November 2025, because the history of that campaign is the context without which the March 28 reactivation cannot be understood in its full dimensions. Since November 2023, healthy attacks over 190 by October 2024 significantly disrupted Red Sea and Gulf of Aden shipping. Freight and insurance costs surged with many vessels rerouting via Cape of Good Hope. This impacted Europe, Asia, and Africa, with Suez Canal revenues falling dramatically. The specific numbers tell a story that abstractions cannot. The crisis created a 9% reduction in effective global container shipping capacity and triggered freight rate increases of 200 to 400% on key routes, particularly Asia-Europe corridors, 400%. That is not a disruption. That is a restructuring. When freight rates quadruple on the world's most important trade corridor, manufacturers in Europe who import components from Asia face cost increases that they cannot absorb without raising prices. Consumers in Germany, France, Italy, and Spain pay more for the goods that travel on those ships. The inflation that the European Central Bank spent years trying to contain gets a new supply-side input that monetary policy cannot address. The entire chain from a Houthi drone launch in Yemen to a German consumer's grocery receipt is visible in that 400% number. But the Houthi campaign did something more subtle and more consequential than simply raising freight rates. The Houthis have made a leap by combining two factors: inexpensive and high-tech weaponry that can threaten even ocean-going ships and control over strategic coastal territory overlooking one of the world's busiest maritime chokepoints, the el-Mandeb Strait. And crucially, they use that control not as a blunt instrument, but as a precision economic tool. Houthi leaders reportedly cemented competitive advantages for Chinese and Russian shippers by providing free Red Sea passage with guarantees against attack in exchange for yet unspecified diplomatic support. The selective strategy employed by the Houthis imposes economic penalties resembling economic sanctions that disproportionately affect EU-based firms as well as Egypt, which is losing Suez Canal transit fees due to shipping detours around the southern tip of Africa. Read that again slowly. A Yemeni militia with no navy, no coast guard, and no formal state apparatus managed to create a two-tier global shipping system where Chinese and Russian companies transited a critical international waterway freely, while American and European companies paid war risk premiums, rerouted around Africa, and absorbed freight rate increases that compounded across every supply chain they touched. That is not guerrilla warfare. that is economic statecraft. And the petrodollar system, which assumes that dollar-denominated trade flows freely through global shipping corridors, on terms that American power guarantees, has no response to a non-state actor that selectively exempts its preferred partners from the costs it imposes on dollar-aligned economies. Now, move to the dollar dimension, because this is the part that turns a shipping story into a monetary story. The petrodollar system, as it has operated since the 1974 Kissinger-Saudi arrangement, rests on three connected pillars. First, oil is priced in dollars, requiring oil-importing countries to hold dollar reserves to buy energy. Second, oil revenues are recycled into dollar-denominated assets, particularly American Treasury bonds, sustaining American debt capacity. Third, the United States guarantees the security of critical maritime trade corridors, including the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea, as part of the implicit bargain that justifies dollar pricing and dollar reserve holding. When American naval power keeps the shipping lanes open, the dollar's role as the currency of energy and trade as a physical enforcement mechanism. Ships can move, oil can flow. Dollars are required to buy both. The system is self-reinforcing. Now look at what the dual choke point scenario of March 2026 does to that third pillar. The Hormuz is closed by Iran. The Red Sea is re-threatened by the Houthis. The United States military is engaged in active combat operations against Iran. And the OR shipping corridors that American power has guaranteed since 1945 are not open. They are contested. The enforcement mechanism of the petrodollar system is visibly strained at precisely the moment when the alternative infrastructure being built by China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, BRICS and Berberic UN settled oil contracts is operationally available for the first time. The timing is not accidental, and understanding why it is not accidental requires looking at who benefits from the dual choke point scenario and what tools they have to exploit it. China is the world's largest oil importer. It buys more Saudi oil than any other country. It is the primary customer at Karg Island's export terminal. It has been building yuan-denominated oil futures contracts on the Shanghai International Energy Exchange since 2018, precisely to offer the world an alternative pricing mechanism that does not require dollars to execute. When the Hormuz is closed and American power cannot keep it open, every oil-importing country in Asia is looking at the same problem simultaneously. Where do I get my energy, and what do I pay for it with? China has an answer to that question that it has been preparing for years. Buy from producers who are exempt from the Hormuz closure. Buy from Russia, which has been routing crude through northern export terminals. Buy from suppliers willing to accept Guan settlement on Enbridge. The crisis that the Hormuz closure creates for dollar-priced energy is the opportunity that China's alternative energy pricing infrastructure has been built to exploit. And every day the Hormuz stays closed, and every day the Red Sea reactivation adds another layer of risk to dollar-aligned shipping. While Chinese ships transit freely, is a day that more trade flows through UAN settlement corridors rather than dollar ones. The Red Sea connects the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean via the Suez Canal, carrying roughly 15% of global maritime trade, including energy supplies, food, and manufactured goods. For decades, its security was assumed, guaranteed by international naval patrols, and the belief that no actor would seriously threaten freedom of navigation. The Houthis shattered that assumption. But in March 2026, they are not just shattering an assumption about navigation safety. They're shattering the assumption that underpins the entire dollar security premium. The idea that holding dollar reserves and pricing commodities in dollars comes with a protection guarantee backed by the most powerful navy in history. War risk premiums are likely to increase sharply if attacks resume. During previous Houthi campaigns, additional war risk premiums for Red Sea transits rose significantly, in some cases adding hundreds of thousands of dollars to individual voyages. Those premiums are denominated in dollars. They represent a tax on dollar-line shipping that dollar-exempt shipping does not pay. Every time a European container line pays a six-figure war risk premium to transit the Red Sea corridor while a Chinese carrier passes through free of charge, the competitive economics of the dollar-aligned trading system deteriorate relative to the yuan-aligned alternative. The Houthis, with one strategic decision, whom to shoot at and whom to let pass, are creating a market-priced advantage for the currency system that China has been building as an alternative to dollar dominance. Now, let us examine the specific capability the Houthis brought back to the Red Sea on March 28th, and why it is qualitatively different from what they deployed in 2024. Because the pause between November 2025 and March 2026 was not idle time. Iran has recently stepped up its transfer of weapons and expertise to the Houthis. The group has emerged as a pivotal force within the axis of resistance, filling the vacuum left by the waning influence of other players in the network. Houthi long-range capabilities remain intact. The specific capabilities that concern naval analysts most are not the standard anti-H-ship missiles that have been in the Houthi inventory since 2023. They are the developments in three areas that the 3.5-month pause enabled. First, drone inventory replenishment. The American and British airstrikes of Operation Poseidon degraded Houthi drone stockpiles significantly, but never eliminated them. The pause allowed Iran to resupply. The inventory that enters the Red Sea on March 28th is not the depleted inventory that existed in November 2025. It is a replenished one. Second, tactical learning. The Houthis fought over 100 confirmed engagements against Western naval forces between November 2023 and November 2025. They learned which targeting approaches worked, which were intercepted, and how to sequence drone missile combinations to overwhelm individual ships' defensive systems. That learning is now baked into their operational doctrine. And third, most consequentially, they do navigation. Asymmetric tactics remain effective. Drones, anti-H-ship missiles, unmanned boats, and cyber operations allow low-cost actors to achieve strategic impact beyond conventional capabilities. The BEU-guided accuracy that transformed Iran's ballistic missile targeting in the current war has the same effect on Houthi drone and missile navigation. The jam-resistant, spoof-resistant guidance system that gave Iranian missiles GPS-independent precision over Israel is the same system now guiding Houthi weapons toward a shipping in the Red Sea. American and British naval electronic warfare systems that degraded Houthi targeting accuracy during the 2024 campaign by jamming GPS signals. We're working against a navigation architecture that no longer exists in Houthi weapons. The degradation technique does not work against BEU, and the Western navies now operating in the Red Sea are discovering this in real time. The Baltic and International Maritime Council warned that vessels with business links to U.S. or Israeli interests are likely to face elevated risk if Houthi attacks room. Previous Houthi targeting patterns extended beyond flag state to include ships perceived to have ownership, chartering, trading, or corporate affiliations connected to Israel or the United States. That targeting pattern extended to corporate affiliation and chartering relationships, rather than just flag state, is the mechanism through which the Houthi campaign reaches into the financial architecture of global shipping, rather than just its physical operations. A shipping company that charters vessels from an Israeli-affiliated owner faces elevated risk even if the ship itself has no Israeli flag. A container line, whose parent company is traded with American ports, faces elevated risk even if the current cargo has no American connection. The web of corporate relationships that defines modern global shipping is the targeting map that the Houthis use to apply economic pressure across an entire ecosystem, rather than to isolated ships. And that web of relationships is denominated, financed, insured, and settled almost entirely in dollars. The attack on ship Inxi is simultaneously an attack on the dollar infrastructure that shipping depends on. The insurance dimension of the Red Sea reactivation connects directly to the dollar's role in global trade finance in ways that most financial commentary misses entirely. War risk insurance for shipping is one of the most dollaric corners of the global financial system. It is priced in dollars. It is settled in dollars. The largest underwriting syndicates at Lloyd's of London are themselves deeply embedded in dollar-denominated financial markets. When war risk premiums spike, as they did immediately following the Houthi reactivation announcement, the cost increase is absorbed by shipping companies passed to customers and ultimately reflected in the prices of goods that travel by sea. That price increase is itself a form of dollar inflation, a cost imposed on global trade by the destabilization of dollar-guaranteed shipping corridors. And here is the mechanism that connects it directly to de-dollarization. Every government watching its import costs rise because of elevated Red Sea risk is simultaneously being shown that the Chinese alternative BRI-connected ports, WAN-settled contracts, and bridge payment infrastructure does not carry that war risk premium. Chinese shipping companies are not paying six-figure premiums to transit the Red Sea. They are not rerouting around Africa, adding 2 weeks and 15% to their fuel costs. They are transiting freely because the Houthis said so. The competitive advantage this creates for UN-aligned trade over dollar, aligned trade, is not a theoretical future possibility. It is a present measurable invoice-level economic reality affecting every company trying to move goods between Asia and Europe right now. Trade volumes and shipping costs are impacted as vessels are rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, extending journeys between Asia and Europe by 10 to 14 days. 14 additional days on a voyage from Shanghai to Rotterdam means 14 additional days of fuel burn, crew wages, port charges, and capital tied up in goods at sea rather than available for sale. It means contracts are missed, production schedules slip, and inventory buffers that companies built to manage just in time, supply chains prove inadequate. The cumulative cost across the entire volume of Asia-Europe trade that would normally transit the Red Sea is measured in billions of dollars annually. Those billions flow to the shipping companies, fuel suppliers, and port operators along the Cape of Good Hope route rather than to the Suez Canal route. Egypt, whose Suez Canal revenues collapsed by the billions during the previous campaign, is watching the eyes. Same revenue destruction resume. Every dollar Egypt loses in Suez revenues is a dollar it cannot spend, stabilizing its economy, servicing its dollar-denominated debt, or maintaining the economic buffer that prevents another Egyptian financial crisis from radiating through North Africa. Now look at the broader strategic picture of what Iran's proxy network has constructed and what the Houthi reactivation completes. The war that began on February 28, 2026 has been explicitly framed by Washington as a campaign to restore freedom of navigation through the Hormuz and degrade Iran's ability to threaten regional stability. But the Hormuz is still closed. The Red Sea is now re-threatened. And the framing of this as a military campaign against Iran is being complicated by the reality that the economic disruption this conflict is generating is flowing in directions that benefit China's alternative monetary architecture. Regardless of how the military campaign concludes, Iran does not need to win the war militarily to win the economic argument. It needs the war to last long enough and to remain disruptive enough that the alternative payment and trade infrastructure being built around yuan, Enbridge, and BRICS gains adoption that it would not have achieved in a stable environment where dollar-aligned shipping corridors were open and functioning. Every week the Hormuz stays closed and the Red Sea stays threatened is a week during which that alternative infrastructure gains users, gains legitimacy, gains the institutional momentum that is very difficult to reverse once it is established. The 50-year assumption that American naval power guaranteed the shipping corridors that made the dollar's role in global trade self-sustaining is now being tested in a specific empirical real-time way. The test is not theoretical. It is not a war game or an academic paper. It is a live experiment being conducted in the most important maritime corridors on Earth, with the most consequential commodity in the global economy as the subject. And the preliminary results of the experiment are not favorable to the dollar's position. The Hormuz is closed by Iranian state action that American military strikes have not reversed. The Red Sea is re-threatened by Houthi proxy action that 2 years of American and British airstrikes did not eliminate. Chinese shipping is moving freely through corridors where American-aligned shipping faces war risk and rerouting costs. UN-settled oil contracts are being executed in Shanghai, while dollar-settled ones are being disrupted by the chokepoint closures. The Enbridge payment system that China has been building for years as an alternative to dollar settlement infrastructure is operational and gaining users at the exact moment when the dollar's physical enforcement mechanism, the open shipping lanes, is visibly failing to function. The Houthi campaign is more than a regional crisis. It is a warning and case study. In a hyper-connected world, control is fragile, influence can come from unexpected sources, and the lessons of the Red Sea will shape how the international system confronts asymmetric threats for years to come. But the deeper lesson, the one that connects the missile fired from Yemen on March 28th to the monetary architecture of the global economy, is something more specific and more alarming than a general lesson about asymmetric warfare. It is that a non-state actor with Iranian weapons, Chinese navigation technology, and a selective targeting strategy aligned with China's geopolitical interests can do more damage to the dollar's structural foundations in 6 months of maritime disruption than decades of academic argument about reserve currency alternatives. The theory of dollarization has existed since the 1990s. The infrastructure of dollarization has been under construction since 2016. But the operational reality of de-dollarization, the moment when alternative systems gain enough users and enough legitimacy to represent a genuine structural shift, rather than a marginal alternative, requires a catalyst. The dual chokepoint scenario of March 2026, with both the Hormuz and the Red Sea simultaneously under threat, with Chinese ships moving freely while dollar-aligned, shipping pays war risk, premiums or reroutes entirely, is that catalyst. It is not theoretical. It is not a paper prepared by an economist at the IMF. It is a container ship's navigation computer choosing the Cape of Good Hope because the Red Sea insurance quote came back at a number the charter party could not absorb. That decision, multiplied by thousands of ships across months of sustained disruption, is what dollarization looks like at the operational level. Not a summit to communicate, not a BRICS declaration. A shipping company's routing decision, driven by a war risk premium on a dollar, settled insurance policy that a healthy missile made necessary. The Houthi entry into the war on March 28, 2026, is being covered as a military development. It is a military development. The ballistic missile fired at Beersheba is real. The sirens in southern Israel are real. The Iron Dome intercept is real. But the most consequential thing that happened on March 28th did not happen in the skies over Beersheba. It happened in the relationship between two choke points on a map, and in the competitive economics of two monetary systems, and in the routing decision of every shipping company that looked at the Red Sea war risk quote and chose Africa instead. The missile was the trigger. The dollar is the target. And the man who fired it from Yemen may not be able to spell petrodollar, but he understood with the instinct of someone who has been fighting a much larger war from a much smaller country for years that the most durable way to wound an empire is not to attack its armies. It is to interrupt the flow of money. He interrupted the flow of money, and on March 28, 2026, both choke points closed at once. The shipping lanes are the dollar's veins. They are bleeding. And the question now being asked in every treasury and every country that holds dollar reserves is the same question that will define the monetary architecture of the next 50 years. If the United States cannot keep the lanes open, why does the world still need to price oil in dollars to get them?